In today's lesson, the topic we're going to cover is languages. Let's start by introducing languages. Language follows logically from migration patterns. So when we see the movement of people from place to place, we see that languages have evolved over time. Diffusion plays a major role in how languages have been spread to different parts of the world. This includes expansion diffusion as well as relocation diffusion. There are more than 7,000 languages spoken in the world. Some are thriving, some are dying, and some are developing. Language is important to a society because it helps individuals communicate as well as carry out the day-to-day. When languages become prominent enough in society, you may see them transition into either an institutional language or an official language. Careful not to get these two mixed up. When we talk about institutional language, we're talking about the kind of language that's used in education, work, and government. So, although it's not necessarily official, meaning it's being proclaimed by the government, it still is the most prominent when looking at institutions. An official language is a language that's understood by many, if not all, of a country's citizens. It is also something that the government endorses and typically uses for laws, reports, and public objects. Interestingly, the United States is not proclaimed an official language. But it does have an institutional language because most of the institutions utilize English as their primary language. A country like Canada, on the other hand, actually has two official languages, English and French. The term literary tradition is a language that can be written as well as spoken. So we can correlate that both with the institutional language as well as how that might impact the official language. Let's take a look at language families. On the broadest scale, all languages belong to a language family. And a language family is a collection of many languages, all of which came from the same original tongue long ago, but have since evolved different characteristics. Keep in mind that although all languages in a language family have a common origin, two members of the same family may sound very different depending on how long ago the two languages branched off, as well as the historical events that have altered them since. We may, however, see closer connections when we look at language branches or language groups. In a language branch, for example, the connection may have existed a couple thousand years ago. In a language group, we're looking at very close similarities between grammar and vocabulary. Take a quick look at the trees that make up language families, language branches, and language groups. The two main families you want to be familiar with are Sino-Tibetan and Indo-European. About 20% of the world speaks a language in the Sino-Tibetan family and about 50% in the Indo-European family. Languages spoken from the Indo-European family are spoken on all continents, but are dominant in Europe, Russia, North and South America, Australia, and parts of Southwestern Asia and India. In the Sino-Tibetan family, this language area spreads through most of Southeast Asia and China, and is comprised of Chinese, also known as Mandarin, which has the world's most speakers. Cantonese is another primary Chinese language, so it's important not to get that mixed up with Mandarin. Now, language families can also be divided into smaller language groups. So when we look at the branches that make up those groups, we can gain a better understanding of the connection between the languages. Remember that a language group is a set of languages with a relatively recent common origin and many similar characteristics. Looking at the Indo-European family, we see that a language branch happens to be Romance. When we further dissect the Romance branch, we will find different languages. In this case, they correlate to these leaves, and the collection of these languages or leaves are the different languages that make up the group. Languages that make up the Romance branch include Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. Now, the four main languages that make up the Romance branch are Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian, and Romanian is included, but it's actually unique because it includes Romance influences as well as Slavic influences. Let's look at the origin and diffusion of the English language. The diffusion of the English language that we have currently is because of the large-scale colonization of the world made by Europeans, especially England. An example of this would include the colonies set up in America in the 1700s. It is also worth noting that the United States, although first colonized by England, also diffused English to other places during the 20th century, most notably the Philippines. Take some time to look at the map on the bottom right. This is all of the territory that once made up the British Empire in the 1920s. Many languages have created by mixing another language with English. Some examples are franglais, which is a mixture of French and English. French is an official language in 29 countries and for many hundreds of years served as a lingua franca for diplomats. A lingua franca is when people who speak different languages need to communicate quickly and efficiently, so they utilize a specific language that they're both familiar enough with to be able to communicate. Spanglish is a mixture of Spanish and English. And Spanish is an official language in 14 countries, commonly used in 6 others, and has around 400 million speakers. English serves a global importance. Many have argued that English should be recognized as a global language, but that's quite controversial. A language that is used to communicate internationally is referred to as a lingua franca, as was mentioned on the previous slide. And the reason it's so important is because of the financial benefit. It's primarily used to conduct trade. English as a lingua franca has led to a rapid growth of English being taught in foreign schools, and 90% of students in the European Union now learn English during middle school or high school. Although English as a lingua franca can be seen as an economic benefit for countries, it also has much to do with threatening individual cultures and languages. There are some other examples of other lingua franca languages, which include Swahili, which is spoken in East Africa, Hindi in South Asia, Indonesian in Southeast Asia, and Russian in the former Soviet states. Another reason that English is becoming more and more dominant in the world is because of the expansion of the internet as a means of communicating. For example, more than 50% of all content online is in English. One of the major contributing factors is due to the fact that the US, which is the highest populated English-speaking country, had internet diffused to them at a much faster rate. China, however, is regarded as a future leader in social media, mainly because of their high population and the large amount of Chinese speakers. So this is whether or not we're talking about the 2 primary languages, Mandarin or Cantonese. Another reason might be due to the fact that they write with logograms, meaning symbols or characters that represent an important part of a word or a whole word. So, for example, these characters might be able to get across a much stronger message through a device like, or I should say a social media site like Twitter. We clearly recognize the grown influence that China has over social media, particularly through the platform TikTok. Now, I know I talked about official languages already, but countries can have more than one language as their official language. So the official language is usually used by governments to conduct business, and oftentimes that language is the only one taught and used in public schools. Within Europe, there are many official languages, with 24 official working languages being recognized by the European Union. Many argue that the European Union can present a major threat to the individual languages that are spoken in the countries that make up the Union. Because of the cooperation politically and economically, there is more and more pressure for one language to be utilized among all countries in the European Union. Some of you may be familiar with the term dialect. So how can we tell the difference between a dialect or a language? Well, first of all, some dialects can actually be considered languages as a result of migration and globalization. For example, individuals who are from either India or the Philippines may refer to the language they speak as a dialect, even though that dialect sounds like a very different language from, let's say, the official language of a country. When talking about dialect within the English language, however, we notice that those different dialects are much more connected. We can understand the language that is spoken within that dialect much more evidently. And so an example of this would be the way that English is spoken in, let's say, New Zealand versus the way that English is spoken in the Northeast region of the United States. So in this sense, diversity can exist within individual languages that make up these dialects, and they are geographically distinct versions of a single language that vary from the parent form. Italian and English are both languages that contain numerous dialects reflecting the historical, social, and geographic differences between many diverse people. If you travel to London, Toronto, New York, Houston, or Sydney, it'll be pretty evident that there are different ways in which people in each of these countries might be speaking the same language. Dialect differences are often easily recognized through differences in accent. Let's look at some multilingual places. There are many countries that speak more than one language, and in other countries, languages are mixed together along with different cultures. A few countries, such as Switzerland and Belgium, have formally recognized their cultural diversity by establishing multiple official languages. In Canada, as I had mentioned before, language and the cultural heritage is associated as being the source of conflict between secession activists from French-speaking Quebec and the majority English-speaking Canadian population. Switzerland, Belgium, and Canada are all examples of multilingual states. The last topic we're going to discuss is endangered languages. Many languages are soon becoming extinct. UNESCO considers languages to lie on a scale of vulnerability, ranging from vulnerable to critically endangered. Recently, there has been a strong effort to preserve language. For example, the United Nations has a program they created in 2003 to preserve endangered languages. The UN, in collaboration with other organizations like National Geographic, for example, will send individuals out to create resources and write down literary traditions of those specific languages as a means of trying to ensure that they are recorded and preserved. Some countries are also trying to preserve language. For example, New Zealand, where English is primarily spoken, also has a large population of Maori people. The Maori are indigenous Polynesian people of the country, and they make up 14% of the population. The New Zealand government is making efforts to preserve the Maori language. And it is important to note that in New Zealand, they have 3 official languages.